For some of you, it's the first time you're joining us. I'm sure some has already been with us in the past. My name is 𝐀𝐼𝐜𝐿, and I'm leading the Africa Squad. What we call Africa Squad, I mean, the Africa Squad is a platform where we bring in, engineers, government agency, founders, entrepreneurs. I mean, everyone who is deeply interested in how technology can take the continent of Africa forward, how technology can be the development engine for the continent. And we really bringing everybody together so that they can create a platform to exchange and to share ideas and to promote thinking, and also create an environment where we can engage, network, and push the technology agenda on the continent. So that's really what we do. And last year we started the general topic of technology, and I think it became very evident that the advance of AI as a global trend was having such a shaping effect on the global technology that it was absolutely necessary for Africa and Africans to have a view and a voice in the game. Okay, so we started that series of debate, and we came up to the conclusion about. I mean, that actually came in from the AI summit in Kigali, where there were clearly established pillars and drivers for AI adoption on the continent. And just as a reminder, you had the first big element, which is data. You need to have data. If you don't have any data, there's nothing. You don't have any AI. And then you need to have talent, because these are talent people who can actually use the data proactively. And then you need to have the compute, because if you have the talent and the data, you need to have the compute to be able to process that data. And for this to flourish, you need to have two big enablers, which are the capital, the investment, as well as the enabling regulatory environment. So we started really having this discussion last year, and we had the first big one on compute. And then we spoke about the data part, and we spoke about the talent part. Throughout this process, we came to realize that, the constraint factor for the continent in terms of AI growth is actually the compute, because the data is there. I mean, we might find ways to harness more data, and that's important. We need to be able to do that. Talent is there. That's actually our biggest strength. We have a youth population, and by training this population, you can actually have a good talent pool. What we don't have is the compute capability. And we started looking at what is the role in that compute capability as a constraint for the continent. And I'm sure I will have more time to expand into the real capacity on the continent, and we'll talk about these different components. But we thought that the topic was strong enough for a few of us to get together and produce this white paper that has been shared, that is widely available now. And I would like to thank specifically my co-authors who are with me today. Miles, are you now in Johannesburg or in Dubai right now?
In Dubai.
Yeah, Johannesburg. Okay,
Yeah.
Miles in Johannesburg. Serge is no, it's the US. It's where are
Yeah,
you
I'm
now?
in Atlanta, Georgia.
And Leye is actually on the plane. I'm about to board on the plane, but he will be able to join us from London. Okay. And myself, I'm sitting in Lome, but I'm currently in Abidjan. So that's it gives you a setting about how we came to this idea. Today, the main reason for the white paper is to sparkle discussion. That's really the most important thing, right? To put this topic on the table so that we can share, we can engage, and and continue the discussion beyond this room to the other rooms, and be able to drive some decisions based on that. So that's really the main topic. So we will use today as a discussion ground to push the agenda further. And the way it's going to go, we have, five key portions. I will set the scene like I'm doing now. And then we will talk more about the capacity, regional and national capacity. Nabais will give us a bit more detail on that. And then we'll talk about more about the capital and investment model. How do you make this work? And we'll end up with the data part. Serge will talk about the capital and investment, and Leah will certainly give us more insight on the data side, the data sovereignty and governance. Okay. But all of that, I think if we come together, it has to be at least in terms, because we are all action people. I think we are active people. So it has to be important to come with some actions that comes from all of this engagement. So that's the setting. Just some housekeeping rules. I think it's a round table, but it's very, very free in terms of engagement. Please, at any point in time, raise your hand and we'll be able you to contribute. Your contribution is expected and your contribution is welcome. And we actually don't think that everybody should agree with us. There are already some messages that are adding new dimension to the discussion. It's welcome. That's why we come together. So please feel free to contribute as much as possible. Okay, good. That being said, as I've already mentioned, why compute? I think, like I said, the first element for me is the most constraining factor that we have. We can have the data. If you look at today with the boom of the telco on the continent, with the boom of the digital activities on the continent, we have enough data that exists. And even where we don't have data is being organized. There are definitely a lot of efforts that can be done to try to acquire more of this data and make them available, but it's less of the challenge. I spoke about talent already, definitely a lot of work. We need to put the processes, we need to make sure that it works. But even if we put all our cylinder behind these two variables and we don't have a compute capacity on the continent, what we find ourselves in is exactly the same situation that we currently live in the industrial age, right? Where we produce raw material, we ship it outside of the continent, it comes back as manufactured and we pay it even more expensive, right? It's exactly the same situation. We will have the raw data. Our raw data will go out to be processed somewhere else, and we'll be told, the intelligence about what that intelligence, should work for us, right? And it will come at much, much higher expense with less control. So that's really the first premises. So it is the most constraining factor that we have about how we drive the adoption of AI and technology on the continent. That being said, there are some other elements, right? So if you look at, for example, the economic value, the three layers, right? You have your infrastructure layer, you have your application layer, and you have your orchestration layer. There's a case that is being made that, if you focus on your application layer, you're going to drive the most economical value. But at this point, you might have the usage, but you are at the mercy of the infrastructure holders. So economically, is not a sustainable model for long term, because ultimately you will be squeezed in terms of margin. And then last thing is that's more about sovereignty. If you notice today, compute and processing has been a geopolitical issue globally, with China, US, Europe restricting the sales of chip to each other, and CPUs, and it's a tool that is being used today to prevent or to influence the global scene, the global politics. If we don't have any position, and the position might not be to build everything on our own, no. But I think if we don't have any position, you become at the mercy of all other parties. So these are the reasons why it's important that we focus on the compute capacity for the continent. There are some efforts that are already done. I'm not saying that what is being done. I think the team are doing really great things with all the clusters, the CPU clusters that they're building, and that's good. That's good. But more needs to be done. In the same way that we have a plan to build roads on the continent, in the same way we need to have plans to build compute capacity on the continent. So how will that be done? I think that's really the debate that we're going to have today. And at this point, I'm going to just leave the floor to Miles. Miles, maybe you can take us a little bit about how we're looking at it from a national and regional perspective, because there are some key questions that we need to answer from that perspective. We spoke about it in the white paper, but I think you can elaborate a little bit more on this aspect. Thank you.
thank everyone for joining. I think, what this is a different lens around AI. I've actually been involved with some other studies with the Agile Business Consortium, where we looked at agility and AI, particularly a human-centered approach. And that's much more around, how do you get the machine and the humans working together in collaboration with each other so that they augment each other. But I think what's important about this particular white paper, which takes a totally different lens on this, and as Inverlice basically saying, and so does the white paper say, is that if we don't build our own compute capability in Africa, we will be relying on the rest of the world. We will be at the mercy of the rest of the world, and we won't be in charge of our own destiny from a digital economy and, an AI-driven economy, et cetera, et cetera. I'm actually involved with a project and that's why Bilal asked if I'm in Dubai, where Abu Dhabi and Dubai are actually wanting to become almost this compute center, not necessarily globally, because there's already obviously the US and Europe and China that are playing largely in there. But one of the projects that we are busy working with the Dubai government is almost to build these mini compute centers, if you can call it that, so that a company could have their own compute center and not have to rely on a larger one. And the reason I bring that up is because a lot of people are looking at this, a lot of countries are looking at this, and it is a huge opportunity. Again, to Enverli's point and the point of the white paper, if we don't do something from an African context, we are going to be, as per normal, left behind and having to, sort of catch up at the end of the day. So then the question really becomes, do we tackle this from an Africa continental perspective collectively, or does each country go it alone? Now, there are pros and cons of both of those scenarios to a large extent. Obviously, if you go, with a Africa wide scenario and strategy, what you're then doing is you then have a lot more power in terms of dealing with people like NVIDIA and AWS and whoever you're dealing with. If you're dealing with it from an Africa, or at least a regional Africa perspective, you have a lot more clout in terms of what you can ask for and what you can get. Whereas if you're dealing with it from a country to country level, then you're going to have it difficult. The other sort of pro of dealing with it from a Africa perspective rather than a country. There are some pros, by the way, of dealing with it from a country perspective, and I'll deal with that just now, because what we're really looking for at the end of the day almost is what we call a hub and spoke approach, which is a combination, a hybrid approach of the Africa version together with the country version. If we go country per country, one of the things that we are finding is that Africa is growing hugely from a developer and an IT skill perspective. One of the things I do is actually source IT skills for companies in the UK, because African skills are just so well sought after. But we're going to continuously lose that talent to Europe or to America or whoever's going to buy that talent. So there's going to be this talent dispersion, which is already happening. If we do it from an African context, then we're saying to the talent in Africa, we have the opportunity from a university perspective. How do we build these educational hubs that can build this? How do we build these smart hubs? How do we build all of that? So there are huge, obviously, benefits of doing it from an African context: economies of scale, power to negotiate, the talent scenario. On the other side of it is that even though we have the Africa Free Trade Agreement and the Smart Africa Alliance out of Rwanda and etc., where we talk about a combined effort, I think there's 42 countries there talking about a combined effort for a digitally enabled Africa. The fact is that each country at the end of the day still wants to manage their own future, particularly when it comes to, if we are going to build these regional compute hubs, who owns that data? Who manages that data, especially when it's, private data of citizens? So that's where we start talking about, to a large extent, that hub and spoke scenario. And I must probably stop fairly soon after this, because there's just so much to talk about around this, but we could potentially have those discussions towards the end. But when we talk about the hub and spoke, is almost to say, at an African level, let's create the infrastructure, let's create the talent marketplace, let's create the creative hubs, let's create all of those things that can make us go forward as an African scenario. And when I talk about, the infrastructure, I'm talking about the compute infrastructure. But then when you've got the spoke part, which is then each country being able to really manage, utilize that huge infrastructure that's been built at a continental level, but still be able to manage their own environment. And that brings in a lot of agility, because as you can imagine, trying to get every African country to agree on something is going to take a long time. So if we have a scenario where countries can still decide their own future, but leveraging off this huge infrastructure and knowledge hub and talent hub that we're building, then it builds in a lot of stability, but also a lot of agility and flexibility. It's not a one or the other. It's the hub and spoke, which is a combination of, let's do it as an African continent, but let's allow some flexibility for nations still to be able to manage their own data, to manage their own, digital future. And I know that Serge is going to talk about, the capitalization of all of this, because none of this happens without us being able to really get the financial power in place to do all of this. And again, if you do that from an African continent perspective, you get a lot more sway in terms of being able to get money in. But on the other hand, if you're doing it from it's much easier for example, Nigeria or South Africa or Egypt to go and get loans from the International Monetary Fund than it is for the African continent. So there is, again, that flexibility and agility. So I think I've really enjoyed working with the team on this, because it just brought a very important aspect to light, which is the compute aspect in Africa. And Bilal, if we don't take advantage of this now, we are going to be left behind. I'll hand back
Thank you.
to you and Bilal, if there's anything you want to add then you can most probably hand over to Serge.
Thank you, Miles. You really touched the key point, and I think the hub and spoke approach is something that is definitely to keep in mind. I was using the analogy of roads versus compute capacity, right? So if you look at, for example, I think a couple of years ago, there was this infrastructure project crossing the continent, the big highways crossing the continent, which was a massive project on paper. Some come to life, some are still, being. But I think it's almost, the a similar thinking, but more practical, that needs to happen in this area. On the infrastructure side, there's another dimension that I think is important to note as well. Compute is energy intensive. Compute is extremely energy intensive. And if you look at what's happening, the complaint that we get from the big compute centers is, the amount of energy and the sustainability of the process. I think we have a unique, given the situation on the continent, we have a unique opportunity to not only think compute, but to think more about sustainable compute, right? We have renewable energies that can be used effectively if the right level of investment is made to support the development of compute capacity on the continent. So the point is, like you said, our compute trajectory doesn't need to be the same. So I think there is to reimagine that compute capability would be for us in Africa. And financing is going to be a key component. So on that note, I will maybe pass on to Serge to talk a bit about the financing component that we had on the paper. Serge?
Yep. Thank you, Nvalai. And you and Miles have definitely touched on some very critical points that we're addressing in the paper, specifically around how we're going to join forces to get better together. Because if we try to go at it alone, then it's going to be a very tough road. And specifically around capital, because you just highlighted something super important. It's all about energy when you think about it. When we talk about compute, the primary attribute is energy. And even though in the paper, we don't necessarily argue for a single funding model, we have to rethink the way that we're funding this model, right? Because the traditional tech startup financing is not going to work. It's insufficient for compute infrastructure because this is not SaaS, right? This is something that is capital intensive and it's energy dependent. And with that in mind, we have to think about the long term, right? The long duration of the infrastructure. And so across the manifesto, I mean, the capital and investment are framed around 5 core ideas, right? Like the first one was blended finance. So we're not going to be able to do capital, public capital, or development finance, or just private institutional capital, right? Compute infrastructure carries long payback period and definitely policy risk. So when you think about like a pure venture capital model, that's not going to scale. FI, sovereign funds, pension funds, strategic corporates, all of these need to be coming together so that we can actually have the right capital allocation and capital structure that we need to see this through in the long term. Now, I'm going to piggyback also on what we talk about regional versus national capacity, right? So with regional infrastructure, it's actually better because many small national data centers are not going to cut it, right? We want to start thinking about aggregation. And so we've talked about the African Trade Alliance. We also know that across Africa, we have different segments, kind of like, on the Eastern Africa Alliance with Kenya and Tanzania and Uganda, right? We also have Rwanda in the mix there. The West Africa, obviously, with ECOWAS, Ivory Coast, Nigeria, Ghana, those are big hubs. Northern Africa, of course, like with Morocco, Egypt, right? Those are big hubs. And we can't discount Southern Africa as well, right? Where Miles is. Obviously, South Africa is kind of a leader in a lot of these hubs. Interestingly enough, when we actually published a paper, a gentleman by the name of Alex Tasso, and I thought he was going to join the conversation today, but he's actually one of the operatives that's on the ground building, the infrastructure. He has actually a GPU hub in Southern Africa that is already live. And so, I would have loved to get his take on this too. But I just want to keep pushing, right? Like we need to actually have regional infrastructure platform, not fragmented projects. Okay. The third piece that we need to carry over is the public-private partnership. Because this is energy dependent, governments have to participate, right? And we don't want them to run data centers. We don't necessarily want them to fund everything, right? But they have to be there to de-risk the investment, right? And they can do that through power guarantees, giving people access to land, right? Entrepreneur, and then definitely providing regulatory clarity. That's a big one, right? Like we need to have regulatory clarity in terms of what's going to be available for us. And then we need to standardize also what we think about cross-border data framework, right? If you think about the internet, when it started, it scaled globally because of the standards, right? And so those are the things that we have to think in mind. And Vala, you just also made another good point. We don't have to copy and paste what's already being done. This is our opportunity to reinvent the way we're financing this infrastructure. And so similarly to how Africa adopted mobile networks, mobile technology, and developed things like mobile money with M-Pesa and Leapfrog, all of the payment rails that are, were built on the West with credit cards. This is the same opportunity, right? We don't have to rinse and repeat or copy and paste. We can definitely do something new. And so about policy, about the government's role in there, they have to drive the policy alignment. And that's easier said than done, right? Because we know that when it comes to policy discussion, these take a long time. But without that policy alignment and that scale, more at the regional and African level, private capital typically is going to price in high risk premiums. Because when you start thinking about Africa and you start thinking about compute, this is essentially an energy-backed financing structure. And so energy is treated as the primary constraint. And so the implication is that compute financing usually has to be structured alongside power infrastructure financing. And in some cases, it has to be co-located near renewable energy projects. And Vala, I think you just touched on that, right? Long-term power purchase agreements, those can become part of the capital stack. There's some interesting development when it comes to energy in Africa, right? Like we just saw recently that the Dangote group just pushed a refinery that's producing the maximum volume that we've ever seen on a continent, right? And so there's definitely a trend that is really anchoring Africa in terms of energy sovereignty, I would say, that we can piggyback on and make sure that it's also powering this AI revolution that we want to launch. And the last piece that I want to touch on is we have to anchor the demand and the long-term offtake, right? We mentioned that these are long tail goals. I mean, if you start thinking about investing in power plants and doing a mix of renewable with traditional, you have to have long vision because those have long payback and they're super capital intensive. We're not talking about millions, probably in the billions. And so I don't care what currency you want to add to it, it's still going to be in the billions. But we have to make sure that that infrastructure can become bankable. And to have infrastructure that is bankable in terms of capital allocation, you need revenue predictability, right? And so the manifesto points to government procurement, regional research institution, and large enterprise as anchor clients. And so this long-term compute can actually offtake the agreement and reduce the revenue volatility and make sure that we improve the debt viability as well. So what we don't propose, right, is that Africa builds hyperscale capacity overnight, because that is not going to happen. And we don't also argue for full self-sufficiency. We can't go at it alone. And, we definitely can't just flip a finger and then make sure that everything happens. There's a lot of challenges across policies. There's a lot of challenges around standardization and making sure that we have some protocols that we can all agree on, and how we're going to share data or how we're going to share compute amongst ourselves, right? And we don't want to treat sovereignty in isolation. And that's why we're making a point here that we don't want every country to go at it alone, right? Because it's going to be a long road. It's going to be a difficult road. And there's going to be a lot of overlaps. So again, we want to zoom out and make sure that the financing model applies. And it's more looking like energy infrastructure. Probably want to have a telecom backbone, right? Because, telcos are huge on the continent. And from a data center perspective, we can also leverage real estate investment trusts, right? REITs, to make sure that all of those strategic technology partnerships are putting together. And it's not just looking at like a venture-backed AI startup model, right? Like we really want to make sure that it is a comprehensive way to look at capital allocation and investment models. With that said, I think this actually gives us a segue to get into data sovereignty and governance. But before we get into that, I don't think Leigh is here. I'll pitch it back to you, Nvalai, if you want to, peel back those layers.
Thank you. I think, in all the discussions, I think the part regarding why it's important and what it is and why it's important is actually, for me, was less of an issue. I think the real problem was really, thinking about how do you fund this really? How do you bring it to life? Like I say, these are multi-year project. The payback is a long time, is a long period. But it's really, if you treat it as an infrastructure, the model is completely different. If you treat it as a road, the highway that you're building, this is a highway that you create more processing capacity. It's the same thing. That's really the way to think about it, and to create to give it some priority in terms of the holistic investment. I think that the danger, like you said, and I was smiling, is to expect that it cannot be fully private. Unfortunately, it cannot be fully government as well, and it's not advisable, right? So there is a blending that needs to happen, and that is something that I think when the framework is set, it can help a lot. And then last thing is the green aspect, because you have all this green energy, renewable energy financing that could potentially exist. Leveraging that, I think, is a very good opportunity for the compute discussion. That brings us to the regulation around that, because if you want to organize this framework, various parties need to be able to work, and regulation and sovereignty comes to that. So many countries are requiring hosting of data in the country. Many countries are requesting hosting data in the country. There is no data center in the country. So where do you host your data? So what comes first? Is it your regulation that is telling me to host? Or is it a data center that needs to be there? And then you can request me to host at that point. So, it's just telling you the nature of the discussions and the tension. It's a healthy tension, but there's a real tension about the thing, because there's a governance process that needs to be put in place, and that governance process is important. And when we look at the governance process, there are a few elements that comes into play. So it's location. So if I have a data center in Africa that is being managed from Europe or from the US with money from the Gulf, is it a local data center?
Very interesting question.
So I'm saying if the data center is in Dubai and I control access to that data center, right? And I control all input from Africa and it's my investment. Is it a local data center or is it an external data center? So the word as we know it as aging, right? So it's not having, I mean, we can say you want a local data center and then, Google comes and build the entire data center and they manage everything from Palo Alto, and then that's it. You don't have a local center. You don't have a local data. You don't control anything, right? So I think it's important that that sovereignty and that approach becomes better defined, and that we are very clear about how the rules of what makes a data center controllable. I think it's localization, I think it's capital, and I think it's access and control. I see my friends Karim's hands up. I'm sure that's a topic that he's our next data center guy. So I'm sure he has a lot to say on that. Yeah, Karim, please go ahead.
Yes, good morning, everybody. And Valai and team, I wanted to first of all congratulate you on this manifesto. It's really well done. I think it really focuses on we all agree what is the biggest point, which is compute. My question to you guys, since you've been working on this, and I'm coming at it from an engineer's perspective, and having been in Africa for some years and seeing the difficulties it is to work with, especially when I'm talking about the power generation side of things. This is still monopolies. This is still considered property of the governments. And in order to be working with energy generation, you're dealing with governments at this point. So the private-public partnership obviously becomes instrumental at this point. But my question is about the grid system in Africa. Generally speaking, my experience has been that in order to harness the power of green, these are located usually outside of the cities because of the densities of the cities, and they're far away. And so, to me, it could easily become two different projects. So you have the green aspect, which is going to generate the electricity, but then you have your data center, and the location of each may not necessarily be the same, because on one hand, the location of the data center is obviously closer to your fiber links, your fiber landing points, your, the coastal areas primarily, or any other internally, fiber landing points. But then you have your green energy harnessing, which may be happening where it can happen, especially if we take wind, for example, or we take solar, having cheap real estate, the ability to really spread it out because it takes a lot of surface area. So I wanted to have that question with you guys from a practical standpoint, because I think in theory, it's absolutely brilliant what you guys wrote. I'm trying to wrap my head around how do we make it happen without also a real commitment on a long-term basis from the governments, because they hold on to the energy.
This is fun. This is a good question, Reem. And I don't personally think that, we will all have the solution here, but, definitely from a thought perspective, that's why I kind of stressed that public-private partnership when we talked about capital and investment models, right? Because power guarantees are going to be needed. Land access for those renewable energy projects are going to be needed. Co-location near to green energy projects also is going to be needed, or traditional energy sources. All of that is going to be needed. But, I think there's also the reverse of that, is that for people who are going to fork all of that capital, they need guarantees, or they need predictability in terms of revenues. Compute needs, right? Like, we need to understand who are going to be the actors that are going to require that compute, right? Like, whether it's universities that are like funding research, or even startups, entrepreneurs that are actually working on different projects, right? Like, we need to have visibility into the predictability of those revenues. Otherwise, it becomes very difficult, right? It's just the challenge to pour billions of dollars without really having a way of understanding when you're going to get that back or what ROI is going to be like. I also invited a friend of mine who's in Rwanda, who actually launched a company a couple of years ago called Africa Renewable Energy Distribution, RED. And he has an interesting take around edge computing and edge power distribution. And I wanted him to join so we can kind of have his take on that. But, I think you're definitely addressing the right question, right? Like how do we translate that from the manifesto into the execution, right? Like what needs to happen so that we can actually execute on those ideas? So if anyone else wants to jump in, please.
Serge, is your friend on the call on online?
I don't see Henry online.
Okay. He can jump in anytime if he's around, or if anybody else in the room wants to jump, because we have enough expertise. I think the beauty about coming together as a small team is that, we can aggregate the expertise. Maybe let's open up. I think the hedge portion, the hedge energy, the edge compute and everything like that is elements that in my mind, I think you can see how technology might be a good way looking at the future, which I believe sustainability. This cannot be a aid-related investment for supporting permanently, right? Needs to be these are really investments. There needs to have a payback period. We need to make sure that there are users, right? There needs to be demand. Okay, demand exists. I don't think that demand. I don't have any problem about the demand. The demand exists, but I think it's important to quantify that demand and make sure that we understand, who's going to be using it, and what the propensity to pay, and how much to really make sure that we have an idea. I'm sure in the room, maybe some people have a little bit more experience, in driving this. I'm sure they can. Oh yeah, I can see Robin's hand. Please, Robin, go ahead. And thank you for joining, Robin.
Of course. And thank you for, first of all, putting forth the manifesto and for all of the contributions. As I read it, the word that just kept coming back to me was yes, 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 aligned with so many of the observations. And I won't bore over anyone with a bit of background, but just to briefly touch on, I've been involved in the shaping of a number of national and regional
I think, Robin,
Africa AI strategies.
It would actually be good to give a bit of background. Just a bit of background of you. Yeah.
Okay, so very briefly, my name is Robin Miller. I'm a partner and co-founder at a company called 𝐀𝐟𝐫𝐢𝐜𝐚. We're an impact firm focused on driving climate positive, digitally innovative, inclusive growth across Africa, from Africa and the Middle East. And my background, starting off in economics, and then I had a health tech company founded in Johannesburg and has scaled globally before I got pulled into the advisory world and now kind of initiative building world, where I set up a digital data practice at a global firm called Dahlberg. And recently our Africa business shifted and wanted to focus explicitly on Africa and also on end-to-end solutions. So advisory into building businesses and initiatives. I've been leading the digital work in both realms. And so my experience has tied over the past few years to supporting a number of national AI strategies across Africa, currently working on one, possibly two regional strategies looking at AI, establishing a global network of AI entrepreneurs across the global south, but about 75% of those actually on the continent and focused on part venture building, part ecosystem building, part re-channeling capital in the right way. And so many of the inputs that have been shared are just resonating incredibly strong. And then partially research as well. And so this is an area where I'll come in and comment on the moment, but just so many different aspects of what has been brought forth are really resonating. So I want to compliment you on the manifesto. And then I thought I would start my intervention, Valai, with what you stated in the beginning, which is maybe there are some spaces to challenge. And so something you just said, I thought I would intervene with a challenge and then an addition, I hope. But when we say, I think the demand is there, I want to challenge and nuance it, both because on the one hand, I fully agree. I think the demand for both the use of existing AI solutions and applications, and we're seeing a tremendous number, the use of what's out there, I think there is demand, but it's not clear. And there's a disconnect with the willingness and ability to pay. I think there is deep hunger and demand to be building more solutions. And again, not just the users and consumers of AI, but the architects of, and we're seeing a lot of that. But I think these questions that have been alluded to, such as what is the return on investment? Because you're not just investing in the entrepreneurs, you're not just investing in bringing businesses up to speed, but we really do need to, as you're pointing out, invest in the enabling infrastructure. So compute, data sets, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And then, of course, the skills and the talent. And so I think one of the things in a piece of work I did last year, we were trying to do is identify pockets of demand and get a bit more specific about what kind of capital was needed and specifically what kind of return on investment is expected over what period of time. So very big difference between the incredible amount of research ongoing, the demand from researchers and universities in the use of this infrastructure and what that return on investment is relative to investments that could go into some of the technology startups, and then also tying those together and asking the question, sort of what does that mean for aggregation? So a demand being another pocket of demand, and then users. I think one observation is right now we're seeing from a willingness to pay perspective, we're seeing that, and I'll virtually look at you, but the most use and kind of willingness to pay from banks and telcos, even though that's relatively limited relative to what could be the potential. And so what happens when you get outside of the countries that have large industry corporates that are able to pay, or maybe let me just take those two industries and sectors, where do we need to go to unlock that next wave of demand? And or just be clear about what kind of capital that therefore requires. Is it patient capital? Is it impact capital? And I like some of the other ideas that were shared earlier, Serge, by yourself. Just as a sidebar, Alex Sado and I worked on a bit of this research together. And then let me just throw out one more point, and I promise to stop taking up so much airtime. But on the data front, and as a driver of, I think, unlocking additional demand, I think African language data sets are an incredible opportunity. Excuse me, not data sets. The ability to build African AI language models. It doesn't have to be large models, can be small, but getting the data sets right and starting to build the models, I think, has an incredible potential for unlocking demand, use, and access for a broader base of consumers. I'm also involved in an initiative right now with the major telcos, folks like Cassava, initiatives like Masekane, Lalapa, and others, where I think next week, and I don't know if I'm meant to be sharing ahead of time, but they'll be sort of announcing and showcasing the first Swahili based reasoning model, which I was almost surprised is the case. And that is incredibly exciting because we don't have enough. But as a starting point, there's also an aspiration then to build 20 more African language models over the next 2 years. So I just wanted to add that piece because I think it maybe, for me, is one driver of demand of complementing infrastructure investments is getting those data sets as well as African language models right. And then I did want to highlight something else in your manifesto. I think you rightly pointed out a few distinctive industry sectors where highlighting the demand, I think agriculture, healthcare in particular, could be a unique way to organize as like kind of an organizing principle as well for how we start looking at the flow of different capital. I will stop talking now, but thank you for the space. And again, I'm really excited about this manifesto.
That was amazing, Robin. Just dropped like tons of gems.
And for those who know me, like, well, I usually don't like to talk, so thank you for giving me the space. But very keen to hear from others and talk offline too. Again, incredibly excited.
Thank you very much. And all your points are well noted. And I think we understand each other again. Exactly. That's in terms of action, defining that demand is extremely important, and quantifying the demand is important because that's when I support the project. But let's open up the floor. Just timing wise, we were supposed to close at 1 p.m. Can I request maybe 5-10 minutes for other contribution, and then we can close? If you can just give 5-10 minutes more contribution, and then we can close. Okay.
Ollie, this is Faisal Zir from the GSMA.
Yeah, please.
For those of you who aren't familiar, the GSMA is an industry association representing the mobile carriers from across the globe.
Okay.
And as Robin just pointed out, we are working with the G6 operators, the 6 largest operators in Africa, on an ecosystem initiative around accelerating AI adoption in Africa. To this effect, we're looking at compute, we're looking at data, we're looking at innovation and markets, and also looking at talent. But what we recognize as part of this initiative is it's an ecosystem play. All of the points that you've raised very much so on the call, the discussion around hub and spoke, the discussion around funding, some of the foundational challenges that we need to address can't be addressed singularly. it needs to be an ecosystem play across the whole of the continent. And that's both at a national level, at a regional level, even within that piece. As Robin pointed out, one of the key successes that we've had as part of the project is the Swahili reasoning model. And there's certainly intent to gather more participation across the piece. We're working both at an SME level, but also all the way up to a government and an institutional level. And our principle is crowd in, because ultimately there's not going to be one solution that fits all. We have to kind of find a fabric of how we can deliver this whole piece across the board. So as I say, I'll share a link to the initiative in MWC Barcelona next week. We'll be sharing the first set of results across that initiative, and then building up to MWC Kigali taking place in June. We'll be sharing some further results, but we're certainly very, very aligned, and certainly look forward to having further discussions with you guys around how we can bridge some of the work that we're doing and also some of the work that you're doing and the challenges that you've raised in the manifesto.
Definitely a discussion. I think talking we truly believe that it's an ecosystem play. And
Yeah.
an ecosystem requires exchanges, coordination, and the main goal of this platform is to enable this discussion, right? These exchanges that we can share ideas and bring up things together. So please share whatever you have and keep us posted on the progress that you guys are having, and we can explore areas of collaboration as well.
Yes, and Val, I had a quick question
Yeah.
for you guys.
Yeah, please go ahead.
What
Go ahead.
is the next step after this manifesto? What do you envision happening?
In my mind, we have to be practical, right? And you mentioned it, right? So this is a first step just to create the platform for discussion and put it on the map. Okay. And I think, it does that, right? It's doing that now. I think we need to take it one step further. That step further, in my mind, has two components. There's one component which is continuous engagement in driving the message at different platforms. So, at the African Union, at, the regional national bodies, with the big tech, the corporates, anyone who has an influence in a compute capability worldwide, who can understand it. So I think that's one aspect that we should continue to pursue. But there's a more practical aspect, which is what, in my mind, Robin has touched on, right? I think for this to be practical and for this to be actionable, it starts with the demand, okay? It starts with the demand. We've done some preliminary work in identifying the areas where the demand exists and demand can, create some sustainability, okay? I think for us in the next step, and it will be a good opportunity to pick one or two sectors that in deeper on computing that exists, something that is more actionable. So that's really the next step for the thing. So at least as a group, we'll continue the engagement and but here I think what could be interesting is to be able to do a deep dive. The way we've worked in the past, if we did this, or some of you guys here who wants to contribute and participate, please feel free, welcome to really contribute and come. I think we can create one or two working group per sector to do the deep dive and come out with a real understanding of the demand for these sectors.
Rodrigo has a question. Balaye, the idea of
Okay.
compute bonds presented in the paper genuinely caught our attention. Actors such as securities brokers, pension funds, insurance companies, and banks across the zone should play an active role in structuring these instruments to channel regional savings towards this infrastructure. Are concrete mechanisms currently being considered in this regard, and how could they articulate with the existing frameworks of UMOA, TIRES, or the BCEAO?
Yeah, that's the capital allocation and investment modeling we were talking about earlier, right? Like, so there definitely are some initiatives to look at that, but I think Valai again hit the nail on the head with where we need to start so that they can have something to build those instruments, those financial instruments, right? Because capital structure needs ROI, right? Especially when it comes to investments, when it comes to people trying to pitch in to put projects together, they want to understand what they're going to get out of it and how they're going to make money. Especially if you want to talk about like UMOIT and all types of securities that are being issued, those come with heavy regulation where in your prospectus, you actually have to lay out exactly the capital expenditure and some of the returns that you're expecting to return to your investors, right? And so without us understanding demand or quantifying demand in a matter where we can translate that to, those financial instruments, it becomes a bit of a chicken and egg type of situation, right? Like, and that's where I think that's where we're thinking that doing deep dives and making sure that we understand demand and we can actually translate that from just the manifesto to real tangible outcomes, that's going to set up the path for those financial instruments that actually come up, right? Because it's not hard. It's just understanding what goes in, what gets transformed, and what comes out, right? So, Kareem, you want to pitch in there?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to add something else before the closing of this with regards to the importance of energy, because it cannot be underrated. There are data centers today in the US that are sitting dark because they don't have power. It's a real deal. So we barely sometimes have power to satisfy the needs of a working society in our, on the continent. So really being able to have that sustainable energy source, like Valai mentioned, is going to be very key to attract investments, whatever form of investments they come in. I think it's, I just wanted to raise that because the energy issue is something that, data centers in the US are grappling with today.
Yeah.
So,
Agreed.
Miles?
Yeah, I must probably stating the obvious here, but at the end, we're talking about Africa and we're talking about Africa's compute capability, but that doesn't mean we have to go it alone. You know what I mean? We still need to go and most probably, talk to the UAE and talk to whoever, at the end, some of the African countries, Ethiopia, Egypt, South Africa, are part of the BRICS Plus. We don't have to do this alone, but what we are wanting to do is actually set it up so that we become a power player or a power play enough for the African need to be able to do what we need to do, but we don't have to go it alone.
Yeah, great. Yeah.
I think that's actually a very good way to close this, because I think we might, because we are claiming Africa in Africa plain AI, it might look like, it's really about isolation and control of. No, I think it's actually about openness, right? Because if we don't have a voice, we don't contribute, right? And I'm talking about Africa as the continent, right? If we don't contribute, then algorithms are being built without us. If the algorithms are being built without us, our reality is not taken into account. And the machines will make the decision that will affect us irrespective of the reality that we live. That's really, in a summary, that's really what all of this is about. So we should definitely be clear about the role that we play as a continent, but we should also be clear about the partnership that needs to be built, the contribution that we need to have, the ecosystem that we need to build, right? And in that partnership, there's a big role that everybody has to play. Now, for us as AfricaSquad, I think our role is to really, put the problem on the table, make sure that it has enough visibility, and then take it one step further to push the reflection and the work in making as more practical as possible, right? So that somebody else will pick it up and maybe it will come out, or we will use it and do something. So I think for the next step, the focus on identifying the demand is going to be critical. So we'll put a small workforce together. We'll tackle one or two sectors. We'll go and we try to really understand these sectors deeply, and we'll promote some papers as well, and try to convene some discussions so that it can be seen, right? The success for us is that there are decisions that are being made positively to advance the AI journey on the continent. That's a success for us.
Mm.
On that note, I think we'll close the session for today. I want to thank everyone for participating. All the input were very, very helpful. And I will not finish without a special thank to the co-authors of the manifesto. Miles, Edge, who couldn't make it. But this was, I think, a constructive discussion, a very constructive roundtable. We've analyzed the situation, we understand it. We have some clear actions for next step. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the next session of the Africa Squad. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, everyone.